Good evening. You're tuned in to Channel 19 Mysteries, and I am your host, Midnight Rider. There's a very specific, suffocating kind of dread reserved for the solitary driver on an empty midnight road. Out where the radio static whispers and the cell towers vanish, you are entirely cut off from the safety of the modern world. You are just a fragile shell of glass and steel, rushing blindly through the dark. Tonight, we are traveling to the desolate, jagged brush country of northern Texas. We are unearthing a chilling, heavily redacted incident from October 1998, a night when two veteran officers of the law encountered a physics-defying nightmare that stalked the dry creek beds of the Red River Valley. But before we leave the safety of the streetlights behind, I need you to do me a quick favor. Please hit that subscribe button, leave a like on this video, and drop a comment down below sharing your own strange highway encounters. Your support keeps the engine running on this channel, and it lets me know you're riding shotgun with me into the unknown. Now, let's get into tonight's story. The terrifying Red River incident. If you were to drive out into the northernmost reaches of Texas, right up against the border of Oklahoma, the landscape undergoes a subtle, unnerving transformation. The flat, seemingly endless plains of the state begin to buckle and tear, giving way to deep, treacherous ravines and dried-out creek beds carved by centuries of the volatile, twisting waters of the Red River. Out there, the darkness does not just fall, it physically presses down on you. The isolation is absolute. If your vehicle breaks down on one of those nameless farm-to-market roads in the dead of night, you are entirely at the mercy of the elements, the isolation, and whatever might be watching you from the thick, impenetrable brush of the mesquite trees. For the men and women of the Texas Department of Public Safety, the Highway Patrol, this isolation is simply a part of the job description. They are the solitary guardians of these desolate stretches of asphalt, often operating hours away from any reliable backup. They are trained to handle drunk drivers, fleeing fugitives, and horrific traffic collisions. But nothing in their extensive, rigorous academy training could have possibly prepared veteran state trooper Thomas Lang for what he encountered on the night of October 14th, 1998. To understand the sheer, unadulterated terror of what happened that night, you first have to understand the man involved. Trooper Thomas Lang, known to his colleagues out of the Wichita Falls District Office as Tommy, was not a man prone to flights of fancy. He was 42 years old, a 15-year veteran of the Highway Patrol, and a former military police officer. He was a pragmatic, grounded, and intensely observant law enforcement officer who relied strictly on facts, evidence, and procedure. He had seen the absolute worst of what humanity and bad luck could do to a person on a dark highway, and his nerves were basically made of iron. He was a man who believed only in what he could see in the beam of his heavy Maglite flashlight, or what he could prove in a court of law. On the evening of October 14th, 1998, Trooper Lang began his shift just as the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long, jagged shadows across the dry earth of Clay County. The weather was unseasonably cold, with a biting wind sweeping down from the north, carrying with it the faint, metallic scent of ozone that often precedes a dry thunderstorm. Lang's assigned patrol sector for the night was a massive, sparsely populated quadrant encompassing Highway 79 and several branching, unlit county roads that snaked their way toward the Red River. The first few hours of his shift were entirely unremarkable. The radio crackled sporadically, with dispatch relaying information to city police units miles away. But out in Lang's sector, the radio was mostly silent. He spent his time running radar near the small town of Byers, pulling over a couple of speeding semi-trucks and assisting a stranded motorist who had blown a tire. By the time midnight rolled around, the roads were completely devoid of life. It was just Lang, his meticulously maintained Ford Crown Victoria Police Interceptor, and miles upon miles of empty blacktop stretching out into the abyss. At precisely 1:15 in the morning on October 15th, 1998, Lang was parked in a gravel pull-off at the intersection of Highway 79 and Farm to Market Road 1197. He was sitting with his headlights off, sipping lukewarm black coffee from a thermos, his eyes scanning the pitch-black horizon. The only illumination came from the pale, sickly glow of his dashboard instruments and the occasional faint flicker of heat lightning in the distant northern sky. Suddenly, his trained eyes caught a flicker of movement in his rearview mirror. About 2 miles back, heading northbound on the farm-to-market road, were a pair of taillights. Under normal circumstances, a vehicle on this road at this hour was uncommon, but not suspicious. However, it was the behavior of these specific taillights that instantly set Lang on edge. The lights were moving incredibly fast, far exceeding the posted speed limit of 55 miles per hour. But more than the speed, it was the erratic, violent manner in which the car was moving. The taillights would swerve radically from the right shoulder all the way across the double yellow line onto the left shoulder before violently jerking back into the correct lane. Then, the brake lights would flash brilliantly red as the vehicle seemingly slammed to a dead stop in the middle of the empty highway, only to accelerate again moments later, fishtailing wildly. Lang immediately recognized the classic, undeniable signs of a severely intoxicated driver. He screwed the cap back onto his thermos, tossed it onto the passenger seat, and reached down to turn the key in the ignition. The powerful V8 engine of his cruiser roared to life, shattering the silence of the plains. He flipped his headlights on, shifted into drive, and pulled out onto the asphalt, quickly accelerating to close the 2-mile gap between himself and the erratic vehicle. As Lang pushed his cruiser up to 90 miles per hour, he unclipped his radio microphone from his shoulder. "Dispatch, this is Unit 442. I have a suspected intoxicated driver northbound on Farm to Market 1197, approximately 5 miles south of the river, moving to intercept." "Copy that, 442. The dispatcher's voice crackled back through the speaker, cutting through a thick layer of static. "Be advised, Clay County Sheriff's Deputy Samuel Higgins is also operating in that general vicinity. I will attempt to raise him to provide backup." 10-4, Lang replied, returning the microphone to his shoulder. He kept his eyes locked on the distant red lights. But as Lang closed the distance, the situation began to feel profoundly wrong. The fleeing vehicle wasn't just driving erratically. It was behaving as if it were in a state of absolute blind panic. As Lang finally got within a quarter mile of the vehicle, which he could now see was an older, faded blue Chevrolet sedan, he reached up and flicked the switch to activate his overhead emergency lights. A brilliant array of red and blue strobes immediately illuminated the mesquite trees lining the highway, painting the desolate landscape in frantic, flashing colors. Normally, when a drunk driver sees those lights in their rearview mirror, they either pull over immediately or they attempt to flee in a straight line. But the driver of the blue sedan did neither. The moment Lang's emergency lights activated, the sedan abruptly locked up its brakes, the tires screaming against the asphalt and sending up a massive cloud of white, acrid tire smoke. The sedan spun a full 180 degrees, coming to a violent halt facing Lang's approaching cruiser. Lang slammed on his own brakes, bringing his heavy Crown Victoria to a skidding stop about 50 yards away from the sedan. He instinctively unholstered his sidearm, resting it on his lap, his heart beginning to hammer against his ribs. He turned on his high beams and his high-intensity spotlight directly onto the sedan, blinding whoever was inside. He waited for a moment, expecting the driver to either throw the car in reverse or step out with their hands up. But the sedan just sat there, idling roughly, a thick cloud of white exhaust pluming from its tailpipe in the cold night air. Slowly, carefully, Lang picked up his radio microphone again. "Dispatch, 442. The suspect vehicle has come to a halt in the middle of the roadway. It is facing my unit. Awaiting backup from Deputy Higgins before approaching." There was no immediate response, just a heavy, hissing wall of static. "Dispatch, do you copy?" Lang repeated, pressing the button harder. Nothing. The radio, which had been working perfectly just 2 minutes prior, was completely dead. It wasn't just a lack of signal. The entire radio console seemed to have lost power, the green digital display flickering and then dying completely. Lang tapped the side of the console, but it was unresponsive. A deep, unsettling feeling began to take root in Lang's stomach. He looked back up through his windshield at the blue sedan. Through the glare of his spotlight, he tried to make out the driver, but the windshield of the sedan was heavily tinted, reflecting the blinding light back at him. Suddenly, without any warning, the blue sedan shifted into gear and violently accelerated. But it didn't drive toward Lang, nor did it attempt to drive around him. Instead, the driver cut the steering wheel hard to the right, sent the car tearing off the paved asphalt, crashing through a barbed wire cattle fence, and plunging directly out into the pitch-black, untamed brush of the Red River Valley. Lang was stunned. Driving off-road in this specific area in the dead of night was essentially a death sentence. The terrain was notoriously treacherous, riddled with hidden sinkholes, massive boulders, and steep, plunging ravines that dropped 50 feet down into dry creek beds. Lang didn't hesitate. His duty was to pursue and apprehend. He threw his cruiser into gear, swung the heavy vehicle toward the breached fence, and hit the gas. The Crown Victoria bucked and violently launched off the shoulder, its heavy suspension groaning as it slammed down into the dirt and tall grass. The chase was now entirely off-road. Lang's tires spun and gripped the loose, dry earth, kicking up a massive, blinding rooster tail of dust behind him. He followed the fresh, deep tire tracks of the blue sedan, his headlights bouncing wildly, illuminating flashing glimpses of twisted mesquite branches, skeletal scrub oak, and jagged rocks. The blue sedan was moving with a desperate, suicidal recklessness, tearing through the brush with zero regard for the safety of the vehicle or its occupants. Lang struggled to keep up, his cruiser taking brutal hits to its undercarriage as he navigated the treacherous terrain. The dust kicked up by the sedan was so thick that it coated Lang's windshield, forcing him to rely heavily on his peripheral vision and the fleeting glimpses of the sedan's red taillights ahead. They tore across the open pasture for about 2 miles, heading deeper and deeper into the absolute, crushing isolation of the valley. The terrain was gradually sloping downward, indicating that they were approaching the massive, eroded basin that bordered the Red River itself. Suddenly, the taillights ahead of Lang simply vanished. 1 second they were there, glowing red through the thick cloud of dust, and the very next second they were gone. There was no sound of a crash, no explosion, no brake lights, just an instantaneous, impossible darkness. Lang slammed on his brakes, bringing his cruiser to a jarring, sliding halt in the dirt. He sat there for a moment, his chest heaving, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. The dust cloud slowly began to settle around his car, illuminated by the red and blue strobes of his light bar, which were still silently spinning. He peered through his dusty windshield, his high beams cutting through the settling dirt. He was parked on the edge of a massive, sudden drop-off. It was a steep, jagged ravine, at least 40 feet deep, plunging down into a wide, sandy, dry creek bed. Lang put the cruiser in park, took a deep breath, and picked up his heavy maglite. He stepped out of the vehicle, the cold wind immediately biting through his uniform shirt. The silence out here was absolute, profound, and deeply unnatural. The only sound was the ticking of his cruiser's hot engine block cooling in the crisp air. He walked carefully to the edge of the ravine and shone his flashlight down into the abyss. The beam of light cut through the darkness and hit the bottom of the ravine. There, resting on the sandy floor, was the blue sedan. It had clearly plummeted over the edge and violently crashed into the earth below. But as Lang swept his flashlight over the scene, his heart suddenly seized in his chest. The blue sedan was not the only vehicle down there. Parked approximately 30 feet away from the crashed civilian car, sitting perfectly upright on the sandy floor of the ravine, was a white police cruiser adorned with the distinctive brown and gold decals of the Clay County Sheriff's Office. The driver's side door was hanging wide open. The emergency lights on the roof were dark. It was Deputy Samuel Higgins' vehicle. Lang's mind raced, trying to process what he was seeing. How on earth did Higgins get down there before him? There were no other access roads, and Higgins hadn't been responding on the radio. Furthermore, no tire tracks were leading from Higgins' vehicle up the sides of the ravine. It was as if the county cruiser had simply been dropped from the sky into the dry creek bed. "Sam," Lang shouted, his voice echoing loudly off the sheer dirt walls of the ravine. "Deputy Higgins, are you down there?" There was no answer. Only the hollow, echoing silence of the deep Texas night. Lang knew he couldn't just stand at the top. He had to go down. He checked his sidearm, ensured a round was chambered, and began the precarious, dangerous climb down the steep face of the ravine, sliding on loose shale and gripping onto exposed, dead roots to keep from falling. When his boots finally hit the soft sand at the bottom, the atmosphere felt tangibly different. The temperature down in the ravine was drastically colder than it was up on the surface, and the air was thick with a strange, metallic smell like a mixture of copper pennies, burnt hair, and raw ozone. It was a smell that made Lang's eyes water and the hairs on his arms stand straight up. He moved cautiously toward the blue sedan first, his flashlight held high, his right hand resting on the butt of his pistol. As he got closer to the civilian vehicle, he stopped, dead in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. The damage to the blue sedan was physically impossible. When a car plunges off a cliff and hits the ground, the damage is typically concentrated on the front end, the undercarriage, and perhaps the roof if it rolls. The physics of a crash are violent, but they are predictable. This was not predictable. The blue sedan had not merely crashed. It looked as though it had been subjected to the unimaginable pressure of a massive industrial hydraulic press. But the pressure hadn't come from a singular direction. The heavy steel roof of the car had been pressed completely down until it was virtually touching the floorboards. The incredibly strong steel A pillars and B pillars, which are designed to support the entire weight of the vehicle in a rollover, were completely snapped and twisted inward like dry twigs. The front and rear bumpers were forced violently together, buckling the entire chassis of the car into a U-shape. It was crushed. Utterly, entirely crushed. And not by an impact with the ground. The metal was squeezed inward from all sides simultaneously. Lang approached the wreckage, his flashlight shaking slightly in his grip. The windows were entirely blown out, the safety glass reduced to a shimmering carpet of diamonds on the sand. He leaned in, shining his light into the impossibly compressed space that used to be the cabin, fully expecting to see the gruesome, flattened remains of the driver. But the car was completely empty. There was no blood. There was no torn clothing. There was no driver. Lang staggered backward, his mind completely rejecting what his eyes were showing him. It was a physical impossibility for a human being to have survived that level of structural compression, let alone escape from it. The doors were crushed shut. The gap between the roof and the dashboard was no more than 4 inches wide. Nothing could have gotten out. Panic, a cold and foreign sensation, began to leak into Lang's disciplined mind. He quickly spun around, sweeping his flashlight beam toward the abandoned sheriff's cruiser 30 feet away. "Higgins!" Lang yelled again, his voice cracking with unprecedented fear. "Sam, where are you?" Silence. Lang ran over to the sheriff's cruiser. Unlike the civilian car, this vehicle appeared completely untouched from a distance. But as Lang stepped up to the open driver's side door and shone his light inside, the forensic anomalies continued. The interior of the cruiser was pristine. The keys were still in the ignition, turned to the on position, but the engine was dead. And every single instrument panel, radio display, and emergency light was completely devoid of power. It wasn't just turned off. The battery was entirely drained. Lang reached out and touched the hood of the cruiser. It was ice cold. This car hadn't been running for hours, yet dispatch had just told him minutes ago that Higgins was in the area. But the most terrifying detail was the steering wheel. The heavy, reinforced plastic and steel steering wheel of the Ford Crown Victoria was bent violently upward, snapped at the column, as if someone with the strength of a freight train had grabbed it from below and ripped it backward toward the windshield. Lang backed away from the cruiser, his breathing now coming in short, rapid gasps. He drew his sidearm, holding his flashlight alongside the barrel in a standard FBI technique. He slowly swept the beam of light in a wide circle, illuminating the sheer dirt walls of the ravine and the thick, twisted roots protruding from the soil. "Police, show yourself!" Lang roared, trying to inject authority into a voice that was shaking with terror. That is when the silence of the ravine was finally broken. It didn't start as a loud noise. It started as a vibration. Lang could feel it in the soles of his boots before he could actually hear it. The soft sand beneath his feet seemed to hum, vibrating at a deep, subsonic frequency that made his teeth ache and his chest cavity resonate. Then, from the impenetrable darkness of the dense brush at the far end of the ravine, came a sound that would haunt Thomas Lang for the rest of his natural life. It was the sound of breathing, but it was not human, and it was not an animal. It was a rhythmic, incredibly loud, metallic respiration. It sounded exactly like the massive, rusty bellows of an antique forge slowly pulling in air, followed by a wet, grinding exhale that sounded like heavy iron plates scraping against one another. A massive intake of air. The brush 20 yards away violently shuddered, as if an invisible vacuum were pulling the heavy branches inward. A slow, grinding exhalation. A blast of impossibly cold, foul-smelling air swept across the ravine, carrying with it that horrible scent of ozone and rotting copper. Lang froze completely. His police training, his military background, his years of experience, all of it completely evaporated, replaced by the most primal, ancient, lizard brain fear imaginable. The sheer volume of the breathing indicated that whatever was making the sound had a chest cavity the size of a commercial dump truck. He aimed his flashlight directly at the brush where the sound was originating. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the thick tangle of mesquite branches. There was nothing there. He could see the branches moving, parting, snapping under immense, unseen pressure. He could hear the heavy, metallic breathing growing louder, closer. He could see the dry sand of the creek bed violently shifting, massive depressions appearing in the earth, as if something incredibly heavy was taking slow, deliberate steps toward him. But the space in his flashlight beam was completely empty. The entity was totally invisible. The breathing was now less than 30 feet away. The air pressure in the ravine suddenly spiked, making Lang's ears pop painfully. The metallic scent became overpowering, gagging him. Lang did not fire his weapon. Every instinct screamed at him that shooting a 9mm handgun at an invisible force that could crush solid steel like aluminum foil was not just useless, it would only provoke it. Instead, Lang began to walk backward, very slowly, very deliberately. He kept his gun raised, his flashlight trained on the empty space where the heavy, invisible footsteps were displacing the sand. The entity stopped moving. Lang could sense that it was watching him. He couldn't see eyes, he couldn't see a shape, but the feeling of being observed by a supreme apex predator was so intense it felt like a physical weight pressing against his skin. "I'm leaving," Lang whispered to the empty air, his voice barely audible over the rhythmic, mechanical breathing. "I am leaving." He reached the steep, jagged incline of the ravine wall. Never breaking eye contact with the empty space where the creature stood, Lang reached backward, grabbed a thick root, and began to blindly haul himself up the sheer dirt cliff. The ascent was a nightmare. He slipped repeatedly, tearing the skin off his knuckles, dropping his flashlight in the process. He didn't stop to retrieve it. He scrabbled and clawed his way up the dirt, his boots kicking loose rocks down into the darkness below. All the while, the metallic breathing continued below him, steady, rhythmic, watching him flee. When Lang finally dragged his exhausted, battered body over the lip of the ravine, he collapsed into the tall grass. He lay there for a frantic, agonizing minute, gasping for air, staring up at the cold, uncaring stars. He forced himself up and ran toward his cruiser. The red and blue lights were still spinning, casting their frantic shadows across the plains. He practically dove into the driver's seat, slammed the heavy steel door shut, and hit the locking mechanism. He grabbed the radio microphone. "Dispatch! Dispatch! This is 442! I need immediate assistance! 1033! Emergency! Officer needs help!" The radio was completely dead. The green display was blank. Lang threw the cruiser into reverse, stomped on the gas, and the engine roared. He spun the wheel, tearing the heavy vehicle around, and floored it back toward the highway, not caring about the brutal impacts the car took from the rocks and brush. He drove like a man possessed, his eyes constantly darting to the rearview mirror, terrified that he would see the brush parting behind him, chasing him down. He didn't stop driving until he hit the paved asphalt of Farm to Market Road 1197. He turned south, accelerating to over 100 miles per hour, fleeing the Red River Valley as fast as the Ford Interceptor could carry him. He drove for 20 solid miles until he finally saw the glow of a 24-hour gas station on the outskirts of Henrietta, Texas. He slammed the cruiser into park under the bright canopy lights, leaped out of the car, and sprinted into the store, terrifying the lone teenage clerk. Lang grabbed the landline phone off the counter and dialed the district dispatch directly. Within 45 minutes, the gas station was swarming with law enforcement. 4 state trooper cruisers, 6 Clay County Sheriff's deputies, and an ambulance surrounded the building. Lang, sitting on the tailgate of an ambulance, draped in a shock blanket, recounted exactly what had happened to his commanding officer and the local sheriff. They listened in absolute, stunned silence. No one interrupted him. No one suggested he was crazy. The raw, unfiltered terror in a 15-year veteran's eyes was proof enough that something catastrophic had occurred. A massive, heavily armed search party was immediately organized. By 3 o'clock in the morning, a convoy of heavily armed officers, utilizing spotlights and tracking dogs, arrived at the breach in the barbed wire fence. They followed Lang's deep tire tracks through the brush. They found the edge of the ravine exactly where he said it would be. They set up massive, portable halogen floodlights at the rim, casting blinding white light down into the abyss. Dozens of officers aimed their shotguns and rifles down into the dry creek bed. The blue sedan was still there, and so was Deputy Higgins' cruiser. But the ravine was entirely silent. There was no breathing. There was no invisible stalker. A heavily armed tactical team rappelled down into the ravine to secure the scene. When they reached the bottom, they confirmed everything Lang had reported. The blue sedan was crushed in a manner that defied all laws of physics and forensic science. The state crime lab investigators who arrived at dawn were completely baffled. There were no impact points indicating a crash. The steel had simply been squeezed inward by an unimaginable, localized pressure. Furthermore, they discovered deep, massive indentations in the metal of the roof indentations that looked horrifically like the impressions of massive, 3-fingered hands pressed deep into the reinforced steel. Deputy Higgins' cruiser was completely dead. The battery was not just drained. It had been entirely reversed in polarity, a phenomenon that the police mechanics could not explain. The steering wheel was snapped upward, exactly as Lang had described. But the most chilling discovery was the whereabouts of Deputy Samuel Higgins himself. He was not in the ravine. He was not in his car. At 7 o'clock that morning, a local farmer driving his tractor nearly 15 miles away from the ravine, completely on the other side of the county, spotted something strange in the upper branches of a massive dead oak tree on his property. It was Deputy Higgins. He was unconscious, severely dehydrated, and suffering from profound psychological shock, but he was alive. He was wedged securely in the high branches of the tree, nearly 40 feet off the ground. When the fire department finally brought him down and he was transported to the hospital, he was utterly catatonic. It took days for him to utter a single word. When he finally spoke to the investigators, his story only deepened the absolute horror of the event. Higgins stated that he had been patrolling a completely different road, nowhere near the ravine, when all the electronics in his cruiser simultaneously died. His engine cut out, his lights went dark, and his radio screamed with a sudden, deafening blast of static before dying completely. His car rolled to a silent stop in the middle of the road. Before he could even unbuckle his seatbelt to check under the hood, he heard the sound. The massive, metallic breathing. He said the air pressure inside the cabin dropped so drastically that his eardrums ruptured. Then, the heavy steel door of his cruiser was effortlessly ripped open, the hinges tearing like wet paper. Higgins claimed that an invisible, freezing cold force grabbed him by his uniform, ripped him out of the vehicle, and lifted him straight up into the air. He said he was carried, completely paralyzed, by a magnetic, vibrating energy for miles across the dark sky, listening to that horrible, grinding breathing the entire time before he was unceremoniously dropped into the branches of the oak tree where the farmer found him. The official police report regarding the events of October 14th, 1998, is a masterclass in bureaucratic obfuscation. The destruction of the blue sedan was officially categorized as a high-speed rollover, resulting in anomalous structural failure. The complete electrical death of Deputy Higgins' vehicle and its impossible relocation to the bottom of a steep ravine with no tire tracks leading to it was quietly omitted from the final public record. Deputy Higgins' bizarre rescue from a tree 15 miles away was chalked up to a fugue state induced by psychological trauma following an unseen physical assault by an unknown suspect. But the men who were there that night, the men who stood at the edge of that ravine and looked down at the crushed steel, know the truth. Trooper Thomas Lang never returned to active patrol duty. He took an early medical retirement 3 months after the incident, citing severe, debilitating post-traumatic stress. He moved out of Texas completely, relocating to a heavily populated suburb in the Midwest where the streets are brightly lit and the houses are close together. He refuses to go anywhere near the woods, and he keeps every light in his house burning brightly from dusk until dawn. Deputy Samuel Higgins never put on a uniform again. He remained heavily medicated and largely nonverbal for the rest of his life, permanently haunted by whatever unseen metallic leviathan plucked him from his cruiser in the dead of night. To this day, if you ask the older, veteran troopers operating out of the Wichita Falls district about what happens out in the deep, isolated brush near the Red River, they will likely just shake their heads and change the subject. But occasionally, on a cold night, when the wind is blowing down from the north, carrying the scent of ozone, a young, rookie trooper might pull over on a dark stretch of Farm to Market Road 1197 to write a report. And if they turn off their engine and sit in the absolute silence of the plains, they might suddenly feel the hair on their arms stand up. They might hear a deep, subsonic vibration in the earth. And if they listen very closely, echoing from the impenetrable darkness of the ravines, they might hear the slow, rhythmic, metallic grinding of an impossible set of lungs waiting patiently in the dark. Whatever that invisible, metallic leviathan was on the night of October 14th, 1998, it left a scar on those officers that time could never heal. What do you think was waiting down in the pitch black depths of that Texas ravine? Was it something extraterrestrial or an ancient, unseen predator stalking the desolate plains? Let me know your theories down in the comments below. If tonight's story sent a chill down your spine, please make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support is what allows us to keep pulling back the veil on the world's darkest secrets. I've been your host, Midnight Rider, and you are watching Channel 19 Mysteries. Do you have a chilling tale of your own? If you've had any bizarre sightings, creepy encounters, or terrifying brushes with the unknown, send them to mycreepyencounter@gmail.com. Your experience might just be featured in an upcoming episode. Until next time, keep your eyes on the dark roads and stay safe out there.